This morning, President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in response to the continuing conflicts between ICE agents and the people who don't want them in Minnesota.
What would actually or could actually happen if the president invoked the Insurrection Act here in Minnesota?
Randy and Kelsey, would mean the president can use the U.S. military to try and control any unrest.
A few moments later.
Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat, is now making a direct appeal to the president. He wrote in part, quote, "Let's turn the temperature down. Stop this campaign of retribution. This is not who we are."
Suddenly now they want to turn down the temperature. Now they want to have a civil conversation. Isn't it funny how that works? Although this is usually how this type of stuff goes. Ladies and gentlemen, I think what you're watching right now is that it is becoming increasingly impossible for Tim Walz and Minnesota Democrats to keep on claiming and gaslighting that what's going on right now in Minneapolis are remotely peaceful protests. After all, we've seen escalating violence night after night, largely being driven by the agitation and rhetoric of people like Tim Walz. But of course, this is the charade that they do, and it wouldn't be the first time we've seen Democrat politicians get on TV and respond to members of their own left-wing voter base who are committing acts of domestic terrorism. They're trying to murder ICE agents. They're setting fires. They're breaking into vehicles. They are committing several federal crimes in the process. And what do the politicians say? Oh, those are just peaceful, mostly peaceful at least, wholesome, concerned citizens who just really care that much about their immigrant neighbors, blah, blah, blah. They have empathy, all this garbage. And meanwhile, this is the scene out in the streets. Here's the problem with that strategy, is that whether it's in Minneapolis or Portland or Los Angeles or nationwide back in 2020, it is really hard to take the stance of peaceful protest while you're agitating and inciting violence, because guess what's going to happen over time? Especially when you're not controlling the situation using law enforcement, right? You're going to see increasing violence, and at a certain point, people's own eyes cannot lie to them. No amount of gaslighting can save that situation or conceal the fact that, yes, this is the nature of the left wing in America. If you've been paying attention to the country for the past several months or several years, many of their so-called activists love to do this kind of stuff, and perhaps that is why today, Tim Walz, after weeks, 2 months of nonstop crap talking about ICE, right? He's been egging it on. The other day, he was saying, oh, get in the faces of ICE agents. These people are heroes. He proclaimed that Renee Good was innocent, all this stuff, right? Making her the martyr and stuff of the Democrat Party. Suddenly now that you saw a lot more violence, now that Trump is, by the way, also threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, and hey, maybe the federal government will finally do the right thing here and take control of an American city. Now he's putting out a statement saying that he wants to turn down the temperature. He just wants to be able to have a civil conversation. And apparently, is he speaking for other Democrats too there? Because up until 2 seconds ago, you know what was happening actually? ICE was trying to have a civil conversation, for example, with Renee Good. What did Renee Good do? Tried to kill them, right? Left-wingers, I don't know if you noticed in America, they're not very keen on conversation. Ask Charlie Kirk how that went, right? Ask the ICE agents the other day who were trying to detain the Venezuelan illegal alien criminal. You know, this is how this type of stuff goes. But nonetheless, I think what you're watching right now is something of a desperation maneuver, a pivot, right? The situation's gotten out of control. Whatever maybe narrative victory they thought they might have had on the Renee Good situation, despite the fact that, clearly the ICE agent there was acting in self-defense. But even if you want to believe that's not true, okay, what happens when leftists surrender the quote-unquote moral high ground by showing to the world, actually, no, we are the domestic terrorists that the right-wingers claim? Suddenly now, I guess this is what you got to do. Oh, let's turn the temperature down. Can we just talk about this? You know? Okay. It's kind of hilarious to watch. So in today's video, I want to respond here to the Tim Walz statement, as well as put on the record, right, what, say, Jacob Frey, local Democrats, the governor of Minnesota have been saying about ICE, and then suddenly how after, I guess you saw a night last night with too much violence for their standards, or it's becoming too much of a scandal, Trump is invoking the Insurrection Act, potentially all this stuff, suddenly they sound a lot different. So let's get into all of this, guys. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe subscribe to the channel if you are new. We greatly appreciate the support. It also ensures that you can stay up to date with all the latest news and coverage. And that said, I want to kind of start now by putting recent rhetoric from elected Democrats on record. As a matter of fact, here it was just tonight as Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, you may be familiar with this individual, actively calls for his, or I guess suggests that his police should be clashing with ICE agents in the streets, right? He basically says his citizens, his own voters, by the way, very telling, want the local police to engage in insurrection and rebellion against the federal government by fighting with ICE agents. And yes, though, those are his own words. Take a listen, put this on record, because we'll talk more about it in a second.
And we're in a position right now where we have residents that are asking the very limited number of police officers that we have to fight ICE agents on the street, to stand by their neighbors. We cannot be at a place right now in America where we have two governmental entities that are literally fighting one another. Why are we put in this position? We're put in this position because we have approximately 600 police officers in Minneapolis, far fewer that are able to work at any given time. And there are approximately 3,000 ICE agents in the area. 3,000.
Fighting against ICE agents. What does that even mean, to fight ICE? Are you saying that you want the Minneapolis police to take up arms against the federal government and have active rebellion, insurrection, and civil war on our streets? It seems like that's what's going on. And here you have Jacob Frey in a very conciliatory manner acknowledging, hey, this is how the voter base feels. This is how most Democrat supporters actually think about the situation. They want civil war. They basically, in their own heads, are already engaged in these acts of insurrection. And their only complaint with elected Democrats is that they're not engaging in it themselves. And by the way, I love the excuse there that Jacob Frey says. Instead of saying, hey, that's insane. No, we should not be fighting a civil war against the federal government using armed police officers against armed federal officers. No, the excuse he gives is simply that, well, ICE outnumbers the Minneapolis police, right? That's the reason he gave. Oh, well, there's 600 MPD and there's 3,000 ICE in the city, so not a lot we can. So are you trying to tell me here that if the number of Minneapolis police officers match the number of ICE officers, then you would consider taking up arms against the federal government? I mean, what an absolutely insane thing to say, but I just want to reiterate to people, this is now the party who's about to claim we want to turn down the temperature, right? 2 seconds ago, they're saying fighting ICE agents in the streets, right? Calls for civil war. And then, suddenly now it seems to be changed. I don't know. Pretty hilarious. But I also do want to point out from this press conference the moment now where already things are kind of starting to move in another direction, right? The whole peaceful protest narrative is a little bit undermined, first and foremost, by these Democrats themselves, because when you're like Brandon Johnson saying, oh, the right wing wants a rematch of the Civil War and that's what's going on in Chicago. When you're like Tim Walz invoking Minnesota's first in 1863 and saying we're in that same moment and basically in that case, right, declaring civil war. Now you have what Jacob Frey said, but even furthermore, the peaceful protest narrative kind of struggles when you're just seeing so much violence that even last night that had to be acknowledged by the Minneapolis police chief, who in this very press conference actually has to admit that these quote-unquote protesters are committing various forms of unlawful behavior, and you can see his own mayor has to sit back there and watch in, I don't know, stunned silence, I guess you could call it. Take a listen.
My name is Brian O'Hara, BRIANO''HARA. I am the Minneapolis Police Chief. At 6:51 p.m., Minneapolis police received a 911 call reporting a shooting on the 600 block of 24 Avenue North. Preliminary information indicates that there was a struggle with a federal agent in front of the resident. During the struggle, the federal agent discharged his weapon, striking one adult male. The adult male then retreated inside of the residence, where he remained inside and refused to come out. Eventually, federal agents made entry into the residence, and the individual was brought to an ambulance where he has been transported to the hospital. Minneapolis police have secured the crime scene around the location, and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, as well as the FBI, are on the scene processing the evidence. There's a crowd gathered in the area, and we have called for mutual aid from the Minnesota State Patrol and Hennepin County Sheriff. The crowd is engaging in unlawful acts. They have thrown fireworks at police officers, and at multiple times, gas has been deployed. Police are attempting to disperse this unlawful assembly at this time. I urge anyone that is at the scene to leave immediately. This is already a very tense situation, and we do not need this to escalate any further. I have faith that the investigators who are involved will follow every lead in this case and ensure it is completed to its logical conclusion.
Oh, but hang on, wait a minute, that's awkward, because I was told repeatedly that left-wingers in America were just these peaceful, hippie, wholesome people. They would never harm a flower, and yet they're out here engaged in unlawful assembly, right? But I thought BLM was just a mostly peaceful protest movement. I thought Renee Good was peacefully trying to drive away from the ICE officer, and it just so happened to be driving right in front of him. This is the gaslighting that they've been doing, but clearly it's not working when even your own Minneapolis police chief has to get out there in front of you and clarify something we already knew. Left-wingers are extremely violent, and when it comes to this issue of the so-called anti-ICE protests, it's going a lot further simply than peaceful protests. We just talked about that in the last video and some of the insane and chaotic scenes you saw last night where they chased ICE agents away from their vehicle, smashed into the car, stole a bunch of potentially private or classified government documents and were leaking it, and then, this was the scene. And yeah, I'm sure though, that's just free speech. That's totally just protected by the First Amendment, don't you know? The First Amendment, of course, reads famously, this is exactly what the Founding Fathers intended. Congress shall make no law abridging the right to smash windows, loot footlockers, drive vehicles into ICE agents. That's exactly what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had in mind. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous. But of course, again, that's the entire point. It's becoming increasingly more difficult for people like Tim Walz or Jacob Frey to even have to pretend as if their voter base is peaceful. So that is why, after the scene last night, we today saw a complete tonal shift coming from various Democrats, and of course, first and foremost, that being Tim Walz, who, after months of raising the temperature, after agitating, after all of the constant demonization, and, it goes on, suddenly now wants to turn down the temperature, wants some empathy and compassion suddenly to the whole situation. Take a look at what he just released today, saying, quotes, "I am making a direct appeal to the president. Let's turn the temperature down. Stop this campaign of retribution. This is not who we are. And an appeal to Minnesotans. I know this is scary. We must speak out loudly, urgently, but also peacefully. We cannot fan the flames of chaos." That's what he wants coming from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. So all of a sudden, he doesn't want to see the violence. Hey, let's turn down the temperature and, make sure you're always being peaceful. While, of course, literally just 24 hours before, literally just yesterday, making statements like this one right here.
Help us establish a record of exactly what's happening in our communities. You have an absolute right to peacefully film ICE agents as they conduct these activities. So carry your phone with you at all times. And if you see these ICE agents in your neighborhood, take out that phone and hit record. Help us create a database of the atrocities against Minnesotans, not just to establish a record for posterity, but to bank evidence for future prosecution.
Yeah, and there's plenty more examples we could cite, but I found this one the funniest because it's literally Tim Walz circa about 2 seconds ago. Okay? The day before he releases this statement calling to turn down the temperature, that is him, right? Not calling off the dogs, not telling people to be careful and stop impeding with law enforcement, stop trying to barge into active crime scenes. You don't want to end up in a Renee Good style situation. That's actually a bad thing. And if these are your supporters after all, and you claim ICE is the Gestapo who's just randomly murdering American citizens, why on earth would you be telling your own people to potentially endanger their own lives? It actually makes very little sense. But there you had him, right? Cheering, egging going on and celebrating the very woke, organized lunatics who, of course, think they're some type of citizen journalist or activist, but in reality are a bunch of idiots, putting people, and themselves, by the way, in these very dangerous situations. And I repeat, he knows exactly what he's doing there, right? He fully understands that his voters are not just filming ICE from a distance as is their constitutional right. No, they're getting in the way. They're actively impeding law enforcement operations. In many cases, they're actually allowing the illegal aliens to escape. And by the way, in some cases, as we see, are directly committing this violence against the ICE agents. But again, suddenly now, he wants to turn down the temperature. And the same is true of Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, by the way, who, after everything that we've heard, right, he told ICE, get the F out of our city. He's talking about the police fighting back against them, all of this rude and nasty things that he's been saying, and by the way, potentially also helping to incite violence there. As you can see, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey on Wednesday called for peace. Suddenly now he calls for peace amid escalating protests, a sharp shift in tone after he demanded days earlier that ICE, quote, get the F out of our city. Now he wants to de-escalate because left-wingers got so violent that people began to notice. And keep in mind, it has nothing to do with left-wingers being violent, because they've been like that since the beginning, and Democrats wouldn't stop cheering them on. No, it's simply the fact that it's gotten so out of control. Now that people are starting to notice what Democrats are up to, now that the narrative is turning back against themselves, saying, hey, why does the left always just constantly burn things and seem like they want to tear down civilization? Let's have a peaceful conversation, guys, right? Apparently, Jacob Frey said the following to reporters, quote, I'm calling for peace. Everybody has a role in achieving that peace, and we're going to try to do everything we can to keep it. Wow, doesn't that sound so wholesome? Maybe it would mean a lot more if you didn't spend the last year spreading lies, knowingly trying to incite domestic terrorism. But yeah, hopefully you can see what is going on here. This is a desperate attempt for them to save their own skin, right? Suddenly, now that the issue of left-wing violence maybe is becoming too widespread, there's too much attention on it, and largely Democrats are being caught in the tracks of the very actions that they were pushing to happen in the streets of places like Minneapolis. Suddenly now they want to call for peace. Suddenly now let's turn down the temperature. It's hysterical. Look, here's the thing. You don't get to suddenly quit the game because you started losing, okay? You know, you had nothing to say when you were in the lead, but then now suddenly that, the other team came back and beat you. Oh, that wasn't fair. That game didn't count. No, that's not how the real world works, right? If you have an A in a class and the teacher finds out that you were cheating on basically all the tests, you don't get to just walk away with like, oh, I still have the A, right? Clearly, there's going to be consequences. And here's what I'll say again, okay? The time must end at some point where left-wingers in this country can essentially commit or aid and abet acts of domestic terrorism with absolute impunity. That applies both to the rioters and agitators that you see out in the streets, who time and time again will just assault law enforcement, commit acts of vandalism, do all this different garbage, and never get arrested for it. At the very most, they'll just be like, oh, some tear gas dispersed the crowd, maybe arrest them, but a woke judge throws it out. You can't keep living in that type of two-tiered country, okay? It's simply, you want to talk about what's not sustainable? That's not sustainable, and frankly, it's the greatest threat that our so-called democracy faces, right? The prospect that these insane, violent left-wingers, instead of being pushed out of power, will eventually come in because, hey, the good guys never had the gall to actually enforce rule of law equally and equal justice under the law, right, in this country. Because you know what leftists are? They're like hyenas, They'll constantly poke the lion, poke the bear, they agitate, they cause all these problems, they're super annoying, but the moment that the lion stands up and roars, they all run away and scatter, right? It's like, one of those annoying kids who just like keeps on slapping you or poking you or annoying you, and the moment you stand up and say, hey, stop that, they're like, oh, no, they literally like cower and start playing the victim, or, oh, I was just joking, man, or some garbage like that. I mean, that is literally what you're watching. That is the exact reaction that you're watching from Democrats and elected Minnesota politicians right now, right? After months of poking the bear, after months of agitating, suddenly now, right, they're the victims when you see a a response, whether that's, hey, Trump threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, or hey, ICE agents are going to act in self-defense. Oh, we didn't do anything. We were just being peaceful this entire time. It's garbage. And by the way, as I'll point out again, this type of history runs very deep with left-wing movements, right? They intentionally agitate, they intentionally cause a bunch of problems, and then when you see a reaction, by the powers that be, whether that's law enforcement, government, right-wing, whatever it is, the left-wingers claim that, oh, this is fascist, this is suppression, we're being persecuted for our terroristic behaviors, but it's like, no, actually, in reality, rule of law is being enforced. But anyways, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, guys. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.